Hello, this is Ron Davis speaking to you on a new monetary reform proposal that differs considerably from the NEED Act that has been promoted by the American Monetary Institute. There is overlap in one respect, but two substantial differences. In this approach, we focus primarily on the one objective of getting the government to create its own money debt-free and spend that into circulation as part of their budget annually. And to go ahead and do this without nationalizing or ending the Fed and without ending the fractional reserve system of the Federal Reserve. In fact, one of the goals of the design of this proposal is to leave the Federal Reserve alone to the extent possible, but in parallel with the Federal Reserve, to provide for government-created money which can be injected into the economy to stimulate it to grow faster, to reduce employment, and to promote the general welfare in ways that banking system cannot do. So we won't be talking about nationalizing the Fed here or 100% reserves, but it turns out there's a great deal that can be done just by the one objective of having the government create its own money debt-free. Of course, it has to be regulated to prevent inflation, but we'll be getting into that in just a minute. I would like to point you to the website that I've put up to give you documents that you can print out and read that will give you a great deal more detail on the matter than what I can do in this short 30-minute introduction. I plan a second video that will go into the proposed legislation in greater detail, title by title, and a third video that will deal with potential political action that might be taken to promote the idea in Congress with the idea of enacting something into law. This is just the first of the three videos and deals with certain conceptual issues only. So I encourage you to go to the website monetaryreform-taskforce.net. Should work fine, but if not, it's actually at monetaryreform-taskforce.webs.com. And there you find three files. One is a white paper on how government-created money can supercharge the American economy. Again, without eliminating the Fed, but adding government money to the mix in a non-inflationary way, as we'll describe. The second item is the draft legislation itself, that has 7 titles and 4 amendments that are optional but desirable, which I go into in detail in the second video. And then, of course, the PowerPoint presentation that I'm giving now, or actually a longer one including everything, is available at the website for download. So I encourage you to take time to go there, print these files out, and study them in greater depth. This plan has taken about 5 years to develop, and it'll take some time to read and absorb. Now, since most of you have probably never heard of me, I'll give you a short introduction here. I'm a California boy, born in Oklahoma, but educated in Palo Alto until I went to Harvard College to get my degree in applied mathematics, and then returned to California and got my master's and PhD in mathematics at Stanford. I have 10 years of industrial experience in applying management science technology to decision-making problems, primarily in business, but I also worked at Lockheed Corporation down here in support of certain engineering projects that turn out to be relevant to the control of the macroeconomy as well. And then I had 30 years of teaching experience in management science at the San Jose State University, from which I've recently retired in order to spend more money, or more time rather, on monetary reform. So I'm not an economist, and I'm not a finance person, but I'm a systems designer. My specialty is the formulation of mathematical models and the development of computational algorithms to solve mathematical models on the computer. I happened to meet an engineer while I was at Lockheed by the name of Rodney C. Wingrove in the mid to late 1980s, who as a hobby was interested in applying optimal control methods used in engineering at NASA to the macroeconomy. And in fact, this has been a line of research by many macroeconomists who are familiar with optimal control theory. And so I arranged to publish a couple of papers that he wrote after he died, because they laid a foundation of how to formulate the money supply control task in standard control engineering terms. And so these appeared in the first issue in January 2012 in Computational Economics. You can look them up if you're interested in mathematical modeling. But the bottom line is that if NASA control engineering techniques can get us to the moon in the back, or to the International Space Station and back, they should be able to also develop control systems for monetary money supply creation. I'm pretty sure that the mathematics of money supply control will be vastly similar to the things that Rodney Wingrove worked on. It's just a matter of getting the right mix of economists and engineers together to develop the control systems for money supply that need to be put in place in order to ensure that the government issued money is not inflationary. More work along this line needs to be done, of course, and but that's another line of development. So let's get back to the issue at hand, which is some legislation to get government money flowing again. So the basic issue here is who should create and issue the nation's money supply, and more specifically at what rate and in what form should that money be created. And the two principal answers to this historically are that on the one hand, the private banks would like to do that for the economy. In fact, they'd like to have a monopoly control over the creation issue of the money supply. And so that's one extreme, which is virtually what we have come to adopt here in the United States, 100% private control over money supply. Now, of course, the situation is complicated a little because the Federal Reserve Board is composed of individuals appointed by the government, but they make their decisions in concert with the private bank presidents in the Federal Open Market Committee. So there's still very strong private interest control over the policy decision making, and certainly all money creation is done at the banks, which are privately owned. Now, at the other end of the spectrum, those of you who are familiar with the work of the American Monetary Institute are all familiar with the NEED Act and how it proposes to change the system to 100% public money in a single step, in one piece of legislation. This has always seemed to me to be an impossible task, to go from one extreme, 100% private money creation, to 100% public money creation in a single step. So I've never been too enthusiastic about the NEAT Act, but instead, a combination or a hybrid approach does make sense to me, which is to shoot for a hybrid money system in which some of the money is generated debt-free by the government as public money, and the rest of it is generated under the current system by the private banking system. So I will be talking about this hybrid public money approach in which we have a combination of powers here, part public and part private in the money creation process, but of course then that has to be coordinated, and so a new entity has to be set up to do that coordination. I have a few quotes here at the beginning. I'll kind of skip over those fairly quickly. But of course the Rothschild name is as well known in the context of bankers who and banking families and banking establishments who are in favor of private control of money creation. And that's a history I won't go on into right now. I'm not a historian anyway. But on the other side, we have a number of the founding fathers that spoke out explicitly about the value of government issued money. One being Benjamin Franklin in particular, who was asked by European bankers, or English bankers, I guess, as to why the colonies were so prosperous. And he said, well, that's simple. In the colonies, we issue our own money. It's called colonial script. We use it to pay the government's approved expenses and charities. We make sure it is issued in proper proportions to make sure the goods pass easily from producers to the consumers. In this manner, creating for ourselves our own paper money, we control its own purchasing power, and we have no interest to pay to no one. And then also about the Revolutionary War, he says the colonies would gladly have borne the little tax on tea and other matters at hand had it not been for the poverty caused by the bad influence of the English bankers on the Parliament, which has caused in the colonies hatred of England and the Revolutionary War. So, in fact, the Revolutionary War may well have been primarily caused by England's refusal to allow the colonies to create and issue their own money. So the bottom line being that this idea of government-issued money is not some newfangled idea. This is something that is firmly rooted in the foundation of our country. And there are other founding fathers that have expressed similar views. Notably, Thomas Jefferson was also very cautious about the dangers of allowing the money power to fall into private hands. And I'm not going to read these quotes because there's some controversy about whether he actually said them. But it's certainly true that some of the founding fathers expressed concern about allowing the money power to aggregate into private hands as we have allowed it to do in the United States. So we're in a dangerous situation right now, according to the founding fathers, and it's time to bring government money back into the picture. So after the Constitution was adopted, we have an attempt at a privately owned central bank, which was chartered for 20 years, the first bank of the United States, privately owned from 1791 to 1811. And then we have the second bank of the United States, also privately owned, although there was some government ownership of equity in the bank. But that one also was not renewed after the 20 years. So we come around now to the Civil War period under Abraham Lincoln, and we have two parallel dynamics here. On the one hand, we have the issue of the United States notes, which were issued debt-free by the government, which is the way that had been recommended by Benjamin Franklin. And on the other hand, we also had the National Banking Acts of 1863 and 64 that set up mechanisms for banks to create money. So there was some confusion in the public mind about which is the better way to go here, government or private. And without Lincoln on hand to push the public option forward, eventually the bankers won in 1913 with the Federal Reserve System, which the banks, at least privately owned, if not the board. And we continue now to have a debt-based money system in which everything except coins is issued by the banks. So here's a little background on the Federal Reserve, but it's basically a two-tier system in which the Federal Reserve banks create money by buying government bonds and securities, and this money becomes reserves from which then the commercial banks are allowed to create additional money when they make loans based on the fractional reserve system. So there's a two-tier system in which some of the money is created by the Federal Reserve banks and the rest of the bank money is created by commercial banks. But again, accepting coins and a few leftover United States notes, the entire money supply is issued on the basis of debt by banks. So that's a very dangerous situation that we have here. And if you look at a plot of the United States national debt, you see that it has been going up and up and up and up at an alarming rate here, especially since 1980. And I just saw a message here in my email today that the national debt is just topped $20 trillion. And of course there's discussion of tax cuts in the wind that are going to make deficits soar and shoot us up to 30 trillion in no time at all, unless we have a monetary reform that stops the madness that we're currently engaged in. Now, one of the purposes for the Federal Reserve was to stabilize the value of the dollar. And in this regard, it has not been doing too well, as this chart shows here. The blue line is the actual historical plot of the inflation, CPI, which is Consumer Price Index inflation factor since 1931. So it starts out at 1 in 1913 and comes up almost to $25, $24 and some cents after 100 years. So this is not exactly what you call price stability. This is price inflation, and I've smoothed an average line through here to find out what inflation rate that corresponds to, which is, if it were the same every year, it'd be over 3% per year inflation. And you can see what it's done to prices since the Fed was founded. Now, if you take the reciprocal of this, you get the value of a dollar, or the buying power of the dollar, and you can see that it's been going down, although it has some up and down based on economic conditions and wars and various things in between. But certainly in the last 20 to 40 years, the value of the dollar has been dropping pretty much in accordance with the average devaluation of the dollar down to in the neighborhood of 4 cents. So what you could buy with a dollar now costs almost 20 in 1913 now would require about $25. So the buying power of the dollar has been cut approximately by a factor of 25. So the bottom line is that the Federal Reserve has failed miserably in its task of stabilizing the value of the dollar, which is pretty easy to understand because, number one, all the wars that were going on have required so much money to be created to fund the wars. And secondly, they have a profit motive, which which benefits from the issuance of more money than is actually needed. So we've seen the devaluation of the dollar and inflation. So now we want to talk about introducing government money into the mix, and we want to do this without inflation. So there's some terminology here that I want to mention. The money can be in the form of coins, paper money, or electric bank credit. And we could envision the reissuance of United States notes at this time, but it seems to me that that's not the efficient way to do it, because we need trillions of dollars for infrastructure. And most money is now in the form of electronic bank credits. So when we talk about government-issued money that's in electronic form, I'm going to call that EPM, which stands for electronic public money. And this is the only form of money that's mandated in the legislation that I'm proposing, although authorization for the other forms is also provided. In other words, we could see United States notes coming back at some point. But initially, the United States notes are not critical. We can make do with the electronic form initially. So again, government-issued money is not new. This is not a revolutionary idea, but mixing it together with the bank money in a hybrid form is basically the new idea of running them in parallel to each other with a new method of coordination to prevent inflation. So again, we're not trying to choose between bank-created money or government-created money. We're talking about a hybrid system in which both are created at the same time, with the public part being on the order of 33% and the private part being on the order of 67%. Those, of course, are not magic numbers. I mean, that number could be a 30-70 split or 25-75. That's something that can be adjusted over time. I just use the 1/3, 2/3 because it's easy to think about in terms of proportions. 2 parts private, 1 part public, or the other way around, 1 part public and 2 parts private. So that means basically the banks are allowed to treble the amount of money that the government puts out directly. That seems a reasonable ratio, and actually, if the truth be known, I've adopted that from a well-known Canadian monetary reformer by the name of Paul T. Hillyer, as described in his latest book, The Money Mafia, A World in Crisis. So my plan is much more elaborate than what he proposes for Canada, but he feels, as I do, that as a nominal target, having 33% of the money issued by government and 67% of the money issued by banks is a reasonable target that would work well. So in thinking about the process, this infusion of government money is not going to happen all at once. We're not going to have a tremendous infusion all at once. This is something that's going to happen like a blood transfusion. Money in the economy is like blood in the body, and there's a certain amount of it which has to be kept in proper proportion to the size of the body or the economy in which it circulates. So as new public money is created and spent into existence by the government, a certain amount of debt-based money is retired as loans are paid off and not rolled over. So instead of rolling over the debt, we're going to start issuing new money to replace that money rather than borrowing again to replace it. Create instead of borrow. Now, of course, the rate at which the new money enters the economy must be balanced with the rate at which old private money leaves the economy. And this can be done. So again, in this proposal, a target blend of private versus public is taken as 1/3 public and 2/3 private. Easy to think about and proportion that makes sense from historical advantage, at least from the standpoint of our Canadian colleague in monetary reform, Paul Hellyer. However, it is approached by a gradual increase over a 7-year transition period. So I prepared a little graphic here to sort of illustrate the way that the government money comes into the picture here. And now we're going to end up down here in the lower right. That's 1/3, 2/3 split. The red is the government issue and the green is the private issue. But it happens in 7 years. So initially, we only have on the order of 4.3% government. Then that goes up to 6.3%, 9.1%, 13%, 18.3%, 25%, and finally 33%. I actually made the charts with a little bit different percentages than what I had in the legislative proposal, but you get the idea that it's a gradual process that's spread over a considerable amount of time to allow the system to adapt to the new money that's coming into the picture and also allow for the correction of error and the detection of unintended consequences. When you try something new, you can't always know exactly what's going to happen, and so you have to be able to react to things that happen that you didn't expect. And if you have a 7-year time frame, then you can do that. Okay, if you try to do everything at once, then you're asking for some kind of a major crash, because if something goes wrong, you don't have time to adapt to it. But when you have a transfusion process here over 7 years, then it's very gradual. In fact, most of the time, most elements of the economy won't notice any change whatsoever. It won't be affecting bank operations. It won't be affecting government operations, except for the fact that the government will have more money to work with, because it will be creating some new money every year that can be used for a variety of things that we'll talk about in just a second. So in the 33 public money solution, we have a public-private partnership in which the monetary base will be created by the government, debt-free and interest-free, of course, and then the commercial banking system through the fractional reserve system will triple that amount, making up the other 67% of the money supply. So initially, there's no change in the Federal Reserve System, except that the monetary base is created debt-free by the Treasury Department rather than going through debt-based bond purchases by the Fed banks. And policy regarding monetary base growth rate and reserve requirements imposed on member banks is set by a new public interest body, the Monetary Creation and Control Authority. So now there is a question of how the new Monetary Creation and Control Authority is going to prevent inflation. Well, that's basically going to be using mathematical models of the type that are developed by NASA. For engineering application, the economy can be viewed as a dynamic system, and control laws can be developed to regulate a system for different outputs of the system, such as employment, growth rate, and inflation. Now, on this slide, I go through some calculations here to derive an upper bound for the growth rate of the money supply based on a fundamental macroeconomic equation brought into circulation by Irving Fisher. I don't have time to go through all the mathematics right here, but the upshot of it is that the money supply growth rate needs to be tied to the growth rate of the real output of the economy. And when you're pumping new money into the economy for GDP boosting investments, then you can actually pump more money into the economy than would be indicated by current growth levels by making a rational expectation of what the future growth rate might climb to on the basis of the new GDP boosting investments. So we have a new standard for money based on this, which is the real output standard for money, where the backing for government-created money is, and all money, in fact, is the goods and services exchanged in the macroeconomy. That is the real output of the economy. And so inflation control is maintained by regulating the money supply growth to the growth of the real output of the economy, so the prices remain stable, thus preserving the value of the dollar. The phrase sound money used to mean that is convertible into gold or silver coins, some metallic equivalent. But under the new modern regime, it has a completely different meaning. What it means now, or should mean, to be taken to mean, is that the money, a sound money, is a money creation process that is subject to scientific, Nassau-style optimal control laws that serve to preserve the purchasing power of money over the long term, something the Federal Reserve has not been able to achieve. Well, we just need to get some of the NASA engineers in there to jazz up the model that I've got and make something that actually works. So I have developed in the legislation a list of things for which money issued by the government, electronic public money, can be created without causing inflation, because of the fact that they contribute to the GDP growth. Okay, one of them is the redemption of federal treasury securities at maturity. Ordinarily, that money is extinguished and then reborrowed. But instead of reborrowing, if we issue new money, this reduces the deficit accordingly, and we can set aside budget sequestration. We can also pay down intergovernmental debts to the Social Security and Medicare, and this will set the national debt on a downward trajectory. For funding of infrastructure, we can create a new American infrastructure finance company that will provide loans and grants for infrastructure development. We can boost funding for clean energy technologies, fund emergency health services for disasters such as Flint, Michigan, the recent hurricanes in Houston and Florida, and the opioid addiction that is a crisis in some states. We can also boost employment through a new full employment office. We can alleviate poverty, and we can reduce conflicts in society that are costing us economically in terms of production, because people are spending time in jail instead of on the job. And lastly, but not least, government-created money could be used to run the government if the debt limit is hit, which might happen at the end of this month, September 2017. We run into this unpleasant situation where we have to have a fight over the debt limit. Well, if the debt is going down, you're never going to hit a debt limit, and so you don't have this problem. But in the first instance, if it is a problem, then government-created money could keep the government going in that situation. So I've run out of time here, but I just want to give an overview of the legislation that has been developed to put all this together in a form that could be considered and hopefully passed by Congress. As you can see, it has 7 titles and 4 optional extensions. Of course, I'd like to see all 11 of these passed, but it may not be possible to do all of this at once. This may have to be broken down into stages also. This may again be too much to do at once. But in any event, the second video in this series will go through each one of these titles and amendments in detail, and then there'll be a third video on recommendations for political action that might be taken to advance the cause of public money in a hybrid mode. Okay, so that's it for this first video. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you'll check out the website and download the documents and read them. Thank you again.